Hey YouTube, before you immediately flag this is simply a review of the Netflix original documentary, Crack, Cocaine, Corruption, and Conspiracy. It's not an endorsement of the substance, nor an instructional video. Cool? Okay, let's dive in. This documentary takes a pretty good look at the epidemic that began plaguing the inner city neighborhoods and decimated the poor populations that were already suffering in the early 80s. We have powerful testimony from former users and dealers, along with some insight from journalists and a couple of politicians and community leaders. Truly, though, the most impactful information comes from the former users and dealers because they have a first-hand knowledge of what was going on. The info starts from the introduction of cocaine and how it becomes the drug of choice for the rich. It's seen as glamorous, and because of its price, it's not readily available to everyone. But along the way, people discover how to change it into other forms. And once that happens, you have the proliferation of crack. It's faster acting and ultimately cheaper, which then makes it available for people without excess income, which are predominantly the black population living in the inner cities. The documentary tells a compelling story on how the epidemic rages through neighborhoods, but also how the police and a lot of those same neighborhoods were being paid off by the dealers to turn their heads and allow it to happen, which then only makes the problem grow because they don't have anyone stopping it. Then it's compounded by legions of dirty cops who are using their power for extreme monetary gain. But this isn't something we've not seen portrayed in movies and TV. But even before that, the political and socio-economic status of the nation was such that there was a growing divide in class status. And that divide was pushing the poor people into an even poorer situation. They went from being on the brink of poverty to destitute. This then leads the children, mothers, fathers, pretty much anybody to turn to finding a way to make money. The lack of jobs was also making the situation even worse. In one illustration, a former dealer discusses how he could have been making $3-something per hour at McDonald's, which was minimum wage at the time. Or he could make hundreds per day selling crack. And to somebody who's barely surviving, the choice is an easy one. Heck, to just about anybody, the choice of making $20 or 20-something per day or hundreds per day, it's not a tough one to make. For me, there were some interesting revelations to this, facts surrounding crack babies, the federal war on drugs, and even more information on the government's involvement, especially when it came to arms dealings. The info that is uncovered challenged what I had grown up believing because it was pushed as fact. So I was learning as this documentary went along. It wasn't terribly surprising, though, when they delved into how the government allowed the transport of drugs into the country. Again, there have been movies made about this. But the hypocrisy that was involved is certainly nauseating. One question that comes at the end of the documentary raises a question that I wish was examined and delved into more. Why was the US so concerned in a small Central American country that really had no impact on us? And this harkens to the entire Iran-Contra deal. The US illegally sells missiles to Iran, then illegally gives the money to the Contras for their war, and then allows and even assists in the transport of cocaine into the United States. To answer that question seems like it could be interesting because it can point to a darker motivation to introduce the drugs into the inner cities, thereby keeping a large segment of the population bound to either drugs or prison, and that large population being black and other people of color. It's also interesting to see what catches the media's attention and what causes headlines. The same goes for what ultimately motivates police to get involved. The information given on the punishment for dealing and possession is really intriguing, especially in how it came about and how wildly unbalanced it is. The punishment for crack versus cocaine was not balanced. Is this because crack was so much more of a problem, or is it because cocaine was still more widely used by the rich and elite, therefore the whites, while crack was being used by poor populations? I think it's because cocaine catered to the rich and white population on the whole. And the answer that's probably on nobody's mind, no, they did not include Whitney Houston's famous line, "Crack is whack," which calls out a famous mural stating the same. I thought at some point it would enter into the discussion, but the celebrity angle for the larger part didn't come into play in this documentary. There were a couple of mentions of famous people and their involvement with crack, but it wasn't the focus of this, unless the celebrity's involvement brought about something fundamental in the influence or the notoriety of the drug. This is not only a good documentary, but it's also a good social commentary. It shows how people can be influenced or controlled, held down and prevented from success by circumstances and laws that disproportionately affect one group over another. One of the startling statistics that were given in this documentary is that between, I believe it's 1988 and 1994, there were 0 federal drug convictions for white people in Los Angeles. But drug convictions for people of color during that time were staggeringly high. I think this is a very worthwhile documentary to check out, and I highly recommend watching Crack: Cocaine, Corruption, and Conspiracy. It's told in a concise and engaging manner. The interviews are compelling and emotional, and I really appreciate their vulnerability to share these aspects of their life that are obviously very painful for them to relive. But it also gives us information to chew on to better inform our decisions for policies in the future. There's also a very unsettling soundtrack to this that at points, it just has this low bass type of note that just plays, and it's not loud and it's not overpowering, but I found it unsettling and I found it irritating me and getting my heartbeat up a little bit and even getting my mind going and agitating me for reasons that I didn't totally understand. I mean, the information that is coming from me was agitating and it was depressing and it was interesting as well. But you combine that with the sounds that I am hearing and it just messes with you. But then also they throw in songs from the era, from the early 80s that talk about drugs. And it was very interesting to hear them and how it really did reflect what was going on in the culture at that time. There's no sex or nudity, but some descriptions of sex, lots of profanity, and some violent imagery. Will you be checking out this documentary on Netflix? Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for catching with me.